Yeah, and I think you're right with that idea of the global war. And the global war is, like I said, makes it more expensive, makes it more costly, makes it more damaging, accelerates the end in a number of ways because the Americans, it neutralizes a lot of the British strengths because the French Navy, albeit not as strong as the British Navy, wipes out a lot of the British advantage because they can no longer move. They have to move in bigger squadrons because they're vulnerable if they're picked off by the French Navy. They don't have complete control of the coast in the same way as they did before, and that makes it very difficult. Now they've got to watch. Even getting supplies across the Atlantic now suddenly becomes vulnerable. You know, the Pop Tart fleet of the Americans was not going to cause them any problems. Now they're dealing with proper navies and proper ships. It becomes much.
Yeah, I think that the decisive factor is it's not that the French are able to militarily help the Americans very much, even though they have a very big army. Right? I think the decisive factor is that British attention and British resources are now going to be drawn away from America in defense of the empire and even of Britain itself, right, which is under threat. Don't forget that the French and the Spanish plan to attack the Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight, James. The Isle of Wight.
It's got multicolored sand. That's probably why they were just like, that sounds amazing. Let's take it. Yeah, well, the British, the British having to defend the home islands, that was not even a factor against the Americans. It's not that the Americans are going to send over a force and invade. So, but now it's now it's a bigger deal.
Much bigger deal.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it becomes problematic. And then we'll go on with the war. But obviously, at this point now, I think that it's over once this happens.
Yeah.
I think it's over. It's just a question of how long. And that's why I think Yorktown is less important because I think this was done. It's just a question. Yorktown accelerates the end in the same way that Saratoga accelerates the end. It's only Saratoga confirmed there would be an end and accelerated it. Yorktown just brings it to an end.
Yeah.
Unless the British had knocked the French out, which I don't think they could. I think they couldn't knock out all those people at the same time. So I think it was inevitable that this was going to end. I mean, I would almost argue at the beginning of the war it was inevitable the Americans were going to win. I agree with you. Long Island was their shot. They didn't take it. And then Gentleman Johnny's wonderful heroics down, I think. So the Americans.
Well, yeah.
Okay. The British.
Well, I mean, Gentleman Johnny's defeat is not particularly significant militarily. Again, it's just that Britain's in a very vulnerable position.
Well, symbolically, it's huge, though.
Symbolically, it's huge. Yeah, symbolically, it is absolutely.
Yeah. And
okay, yeah.
And then we're going to talk about how we'll do some 10 markers at some point, whether how or Burgoyne is more important, whether the second and first content.
Look, students, I strongly encourage you to argue that Burgoyne was the best general.
It's not.
And that with a piano, he could have, raised the morale of the British.
the Pied Piper, just playing piano tunes to the British. And God Save the King on the piano. It's like, trust me, I'm with you guys. Strategic genius of Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. I mean,
so is it worth saying a little bit more about some of the important factors of this global war?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, because it's important for what other factors to bring in? Go on, if you want.
Yeah. So the question is, what does France want?
Yeah.
Right. What's France's motivation? Revenge. Well, revenge, la vengeance, the vengeance.
Yeah.
And obviously the French hate. They've always hated the British.
Yeah.
They still do.
And they had their asses kicked in the 7 Years' War.
and absolutely. So this is this is revenge for the 7 Years' War. That Britain maybe was too successful in that. Now everyone's going to stick it into the British as a result.
Well, that's always the case. When one global superpower is bigger than anyone else, everyone's
that happens to Napoleon, right? Yeah. As well. Yeah. Okay, so France. What does France hope to gain? Well, apart from separating America from Britain, maybe it can make some get some gains in the Caribbean.
Yeah, for sure, which is the lucrative heart of the British Empire, and they can get that back. Yeah. And India, I think they want to get back into India as well because they know
absolutely. Yeah. So it's is France? So, but there's an irony to this as well that's worth mentioning. Look, think about France. France is it's an absolute monarchy, and it's Catholic. You can't think of something more antithetical to the American ideal than that, can you? I mean, it's a strange kind of ally to have.
Well, it's quite ironic, I suppose, considering they were worried that Quebec Act meant that they were becoming like France. So instead, they went and got the real France.
Very, very strange. And then there's the Spanish. So the Spanish joined the war a year after that, but they joined. They said Spain joins as an ally to France, not really as an ally to the Americans. And what does Spain want? Well, Spain wants to regain Florida's, and particularly Minorca and Gibraltar, which the British have control. Yeah, and Jamaica.
Is it kind of weird? I'm just thinking, it just occurred to me. Is it not weird that the Quebecois didn't rebel up against the British once the French were on the side of the Americans? Because that could have been their moment. Maybe they were like, we're happy to be out of being a despotic empire, but that was their moment to get back, surely. Because if they'd have unified with the Americans and won, they could have had, while the French were on board, they could have possibly had their own independence.
Really good question. Yeah, that's right. I don't know what the answer is.
It only occurred to me now. I'm thinking, why didn't they take that moment?
Yeah. So there's that. So Spain is in the war. Spain has, it's got even parts of what's now considered. Well, hang on, no, but there's still a lot of British in Gibraltar now, right? Like holiday. British holiday makers.
It's a naval base. There wasn't. I mean,
it's a British naval base.
It's like 1 kilometer of land, so it's nice.
Yeah.
And it's just a rock, so no one would be living on it apart from the monkeys. So that a rock and an airport.
A rock and
I was there last summer. It's nice, but it's not a real place. Yeah.
So there's that, but so there's also Britain in 1780 declares war against Holland.
Yeah.
Right. Holland is helping the French.
Yeah.
And the Dutch are competing with the British for commercial interests, particularly I think in India, in the Spice Islands, there's a lot of conflict between the Dutch and the British.
Yeah, Banda Island, Island of Rum, all over the Spice Islands. Yeah, because at that point the Spice Island trade is the most lucrative in the whole world, and the British.
Yeah, that's right. To put it in perspective, that's huge.
Yeah,
and then the final
big thing.
Nothing.
Because it was only grown on one island. So whoever controlled that island had the entire monopoly of nutmeg. That was the craziness of the Spice Islands. They're all from one little island in Indonesia. If you had that island, you had a monopoly on the whole trade of that product.
Wow.
Until you know what the British did with all these things? So it's a bit off topic. But the British used to invade these places. What we did with Brazil had a monopoly on rubber. Rubber plant was only in the Amazon. So the British used to send around pirates to steal bits of these plants and take them away and plant them somewhere in the British Empire so we could grow them outside and kill their monopolies.
Did it work?
That's why there's no monopolies on all these spices and on rubber and anything anymore. The British took them out and knocked them out.
Very clever.
Trade before free trade, or be it via piracy.
Very clever. So the last thing is that there's a thing called the League of Armed Neutrality. This is in 1780. Yeah, no,
League of Armed Neutrality sounds like a Marvel group. Yeah, who's in that?
I know. That's right. The League of Extraordinary Armed Neutrality. So and that's composed of Russia, Sweden, Denmark, Prussia, Portugal, and Austria. So Austria is
anyone else.
Everything. So just think about that. It's England. So Britain is absolutely isolated. Yeah.
But the bigger importance of that is neutrality. It means that none of those people are going to take advantage of France's moment of war. So what it does for the French is means they can go full guns at the British because they know that no one's coming at their back, unlike in other wars.
Absolutely, that's right. And so this gets into the complicated calculations of European continental politics.
Yeah.
You know, for example, if Britain had allied with Russia to threaten France, then they could exert pressure there. But Britain is absolutely alone.
Yeah. Literally, there's not even a single country left because they all have
from
a single independent.
That's right. And from a British foreign policy perspective, that's disastrous.
Yeah.
Britain has always depended on dividing European powers, right?
And trade. That means
they're trading. So Britain has always needed to have, well, not always, but in the last few hundred years, the #1 navy, and allies on the continent to fight other enemies on the continent.
Well, to keep the French army busy.
Yeah, or the Germans, as it
The
happens
Germans
later,
were always our allies. We didn't have any wars with the Germans until World War One.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so that's all I wanted to mention. But I think so the stakes are a lot higher now for Britain, and I think Britain's priorities are definitely. I think victory in America, somehow defeating the American colonies, is now not the priority in this war.
Yeah, and I think that's really vitally important. It's a big inflection where Saratoga changes everything. And then we'll briefly go through the last part. So then the British decide to change their campaign to the south because they think they've now, the army in the north is gone. Burgoyne's force is gone. The idea of capturing Boston is laughable. They're like, all right, in the south, we will get more loyalist support. But the problem in the south is they've offered to free the slaves. So the southern colonies are not, if they'd have gone into the southern colonies at the beginning, maybe they could have rolled them up. Yeah. Like if they started in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and not offered to free the slaves, maybe they could have rolled up. You would have had basically the American Civil War early because you would have had that Confederacy versus like the North in the side part, and those tensions were still there. I think Tarleton's quarter in the South was particularly problematic as well. Obviously, Tarleton, we talked about him, refusing any surrender and just massacring forces. I think then.
Oh yeah, this guy, he was a piece of work, wasn't he?
Yeah. So he didn't take any surrender from people. He would kill everyone, no prisoners. So of course that then meant the Americans reciprocated with that, and that the fighting in the South was particularly brutal, far more brutal than anywhere else, because it was like no holds barred.
Yeah, I think that episode, I think Banastra Tarleton, what a name that is.
Yeah.
That I think that proves the point that the British could not afford to go all out against the Americans. I think Tarleton does try to do this.
Yeah, they definitely
and he creates such an overwhelming sense of opposition. He alienates any potential supporters that's just not sustainable.
Yeah,
but, he's eventually defeated, I think.
Yeah, he defeated and killed. I think that would be the best. Probably he's the best example of why the scorched earth tactic wouldn't have worked. Because
exactly. That's well put,
and it didn't work. So it's a good counter, using Tarleton as a reason to be a good counter argument to the fact that couldn't work. So they win battles in the South. They take Charleston. They take Savannah. They take the port cities. But again, it doesn't matter because the Americans just roll in lands as soon as they leave. And they win battle after battle as soon as they take an area. The loyalists come up. They leave. The loyalists are tarred and feathered. They won't rise up anymore. It's not possible to win this, I think. And then obviously they have all these issues in the South. They thought if they took Savannah in December 1778, they thought they would be able to roll on from that. They evacuated Philadelphia. They didn't see the point in really hanging on to it. And then the South ended up in civil war effectively as well, because you've got civil war between the rich and the poorer areas. So they were fighting their own civil war for who was going to be in charge of the southern states at the end of it, which was won by the elites, which is why Virginia had such a strong position in the end. And I think eventually, obviously, they keep winning, but keep effectively losing. Cornwallis has the Southern Army, decides to retreat.
So Cornwallis has appeared on the scene. He's replaced. He's sent to be the second in command to Gates.
Yeah, right. And he runs the Southern campaign.
He runs the Southern campaign. Yeah.
It's Howe, you mean? Gates on the other side.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
Howe. I'm sorry.
And he's running all of the Southern campaign, and they win. And they hold New York, they hold Charleston, they hold Savannah. Benedict Arnold was going to give them West Point, but he gets to train over. But Benedict Arnold gets captured, outed as a traitor. He's killed. Or no, he's exiled.
No, he's not. He escapes.
It's his second. Yeah, sorry.
So Benedict Arnold, he manages to get to Britain, and he has a career after that. But his poor trusty messenger, who was conveying all of these treasonous messages, he gets captured and hanged.
Yeah,
it's a traitor.
And I think the thing is with Cornwallis, he realizes he can't win the battles. He goes to the coast to retreat up, waiting for the British ships to pick him up at Yorktown, but the British ships are in the Caribbean, which I think if French hadn't entered, they wouldn't have been there. So they would have been there to pick him up. Whether that would have made any difference, I don't know. but the fact he's there on the coast, Washington finally moves his army to pin him down, and the French Navy comes in from the other side. There's no evacuation possibility. They're massively outnumbered. He has no supplies again, and he surrenders another 7,000 troops. So that's another 7,000 to go on top of Gates's 5,000.
It's tricky because Cornwallis wants to pacify the South.
Yeah,
he does it to some extent, but it's also there's a problem because New York is now under threat from the French.
Yeah.
Okay, so they basically have to kind of look over their shoulders all the time and make sure that they're not going to have to face a massive French army that's just landed in somewhere in the vicinity of New York or Virginia, and so they go back. So Cornwallis decides to go to Virginia, right?
Yeah,
from I think from Georgia
and
North Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have this confrontation. Now, I think that there's an amazing fact in all of this that I just this reflects the chanciness of war, right? So you have Cornwallis. He's trapped. He's kind of stuck in a corner.
Yeah,
in Yorktown,
and he picked an indefensible town area because it was easier to be evacuated from, but there was no ships coming to evacuate him.
Yeah, so he was there was. He was expecting to be evacuated. But it just so happened that de Grasse's fleet, right? So this is the French fleet. They've already been defeated. This fleet has been defeated off La Sainte in the French island, near the French island of Guadeloupe. I was actually, do you know, I actually spent New Year's Eve on that very island, La Sainte.
There you go.
Where that defeat happened.
Did you celebrate the French naval defeat there?
Look, I remarked on it, but I was
Did that go down very well?
I was with my French girlfriend and with a bunch of French people, so I had to tone it down.
Yeah.
But they do have a museum there. Anyway, so de Grasse, he's actually captured. The admiral is captured in that naval battle, but his fleet obviously retreats and they come back.
Yeah.
And miraculously, they manage to repulse the British fleet so that the British can't get to Chesapeake Bay to reinforce Cornwallis.
Yeah.
This is the first French naval victory since 1690.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like, it's a fluke.
maybe they learn. Takes them time, but they learn.
Can you believe that? So who could have thought? So the fact that the French
British admiral who lost that, they must be like, it's like, you know, you just go down in history. You're the only British admiral to lose to a French fleet.
It's funny though, because it's funny because the myth of the War of Independence doesn't really emphasize very much the role of the French.
Why would it? Americans don't emphasize anyone else's help. They don't need it.
Well, you know,
God's country.
So, and I have to confess, you know, when I was in La Sainte in the island in the museum, the French were very clear about the fact that they were indispensable to the American victory.
Well, they would. I mean, they have the same problem with their history the Americans have with theirs. I'm not saying the British aren't any better, to be absolutely honest. You know, so it's like, you know, every country has their, you know, it's only recently that they've started studying defeats in history. It was always just like all the wins your country had and the other bits don't exist.
But in this case, actually, the French were quite right. I think that the French are indispensable. They're indispensable, at least in this particular victory.
Yeah.
But I found something very strange because before I read this history, I thought that Cornwallis's surrender was some kind of really catastrophic British defeat that made it impossible to continue the war. And that's actually not the case. I think the British could have continued fighting.
Yeah, but symbolically, I think it was, again, it's like you've surrendered a second army. They're not going to win this. It was costing too much money. So I think they were just like, enough.
Well, and I mean, there's a change of government in England.
Maybe losing to a French fleet was more important because it happened just before your time, because they're like, oh my God, we could lose the Caribbean because they've actually beaten us.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a repulse. I don't think it's a defeat.
Well, that's enough, though. I mean,
yeah, it's just that's enough.
When you're used to winning every naval battle, suddenly If it's a possibility, you could lose. So maybe even the repulse of the French fleet is more significant than Yorktown itself, because it symbolizes the British might not actually be able to hold the Caribbean if they don't concentrate on the Navy.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. That's worth thinking about.
Yeah,
but so as this is happening, there's a change of government in England.
Yeah,
right. And so North falls. North's majority goes. He's replaced by the Marquis.
Is he replaced because of this defeat, though, or it happens just in general? Is it Yorktown that causes the change in government?
I don't think
embarrassment.
so. I don't think so. I'm not sure. I think what you could say is it's probable that British failures in America have made have given much more political credibility to opponents of the war.
Yes. And the fact they've managed to get themselves isolated diplomatically into such a terrible situation as well.
Yeah. And so this government in 1780 in the general election is replaced by a much more sympathetic, a government, Rockingham, it's much more sympathetic to the colonists. Or now to the new Americans. I should say Americans now, because they are independent. Right, Earl of Shelburne. And so, can I ask? Because I'm really curious about what
you know that Rockingham was also the government. This is interesting. I didn't know it was Rockingham. Rockingham was the government that repealed the Stamp Act.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That would make sense. That would make sense. That it swung back to the side that sees some sympathy with the Americans. So the fact that Rockingham comes back in again is vitally important, because he repealed the Stamp Act and now he's going to end the war.
Yeah, and so I'm curious about this, because I thought this was really interesting too. So we have the Treaty of Paris.
Yeah.
Right? So this is the negotiations of the British and the Americans for peace.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is that that Rockingham, the British are extremely generous to the Americans. Right?
Yeah.
And
giving the Northwest Territory is the big thing, I think. Giving all the Northwest Territory they could have kept in Quebec, they gave it to the Americans. Is massively important.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. So they could have made it much more difficult, even in that position.
And the Ohio Valley. So all the things they've been promising to protect in the Western expansion, they gave to the Americans all the way up to the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
But who do they want to hurt more? They don't want to hurt the Americans. They still see them as potential allies. Even though they've just fought rebellion against them, their main aim is to keep the French out of North America.
Well, that's right, and I think that the fact that the peace was so they made so many concessions actually ended up putting a wedge between an potential Anglo-French alliance.
Yeah.
So it ends rather strangely, this story.
But do you think Yorktown is significant? I think Saratoga is much more significant than Yorktown.
I agree. I mean, if Yorktown hadn't happened, let's say that the French had been defeated by the British Navy and the British had managed to reinforce or evacuate Cornwallis, much longer would the war have lasted? Well, it seems like the British are in a position now where any defeat leads to major consequences of morale.
But also, the Rockingham administration, if it was in before Yorktown, would have been sympathetic, so they would have looked for an excuse anyway, I think. So the first chance they got, they would have done it.
Yeah.
So, I think that's important for things. So then we get to the final debate. Why did they win the war? Was it British weakness, American strength, or external factors? We know what the French would argue.
I think you can make a case on either. I think you can make a good argument on any of those.
Yeah, they have to come up with counter arguments. You want to pick one and make the counter argument why it's more important than the other two, and then I'll do one of the other ones, and then we can kind of jointly do that.
All right. Okay. So I'm most tempted to say that it's British weakness.
So why more important than American strength or French entry? Go give the counter arguments for them.
I think that if the British were more decisive, they could have destroyed the rebellion in its initial phases.
Where particularly?
Well, at Long Island, particularly.
Yeah.
At Long Island.
So you think it was Howe's weakness was the bigger problem, that he didn't act in Long Island, didn't take the initiative?
I think you could make a very good argument that's the case. And also you could say that as powerful as Britain is, it can't this would be, I guess, a counter argument for maybe for external factors. But once France, Spain, once the other European powers join the war against Britain, Britain simply doesn't have the capacity to commit to a successful campaign in America, and that arguably is a British weakness, isn't it?
Well, I think you could make the case that without Saratoga, which was because of Burgoyne's and Howe's terrible coordination, terrible organization in general, without Saratoga, the French wouldn't have entered, and Saratoga wouldn't happen without British weakness. So I think that's right. You would make the case for that one against the external factors. It was British weakness that led to. It wasn't American strength. Gates get lucky. It's not Gates's brilliant strategic generalship that wins that. It's Burgoyne's incompetence and Howe's inability to relieve him. I think.
Or Washington's generalship in Long Island.
He was allowed to escape, and like the only thing they did proactively was Trenton. I don't think that shifts the needle very much in terms of the win. No, I'll make a case for American strength because we're going to make the case for the other ones. You kind of made the case for external factors as well, and I would say like you could make the case that the Americans without French help wouldn't have been able to win, which is why the external factors is more important than American strength. I think the key point there is I don't think it affected America's ability to win. I think it just sped up the timeline. So that would be the Americans would have won anyway, but I think that the French entry definitely accelerated it.
And you could support that argument by saying it doesn't really matter how many battles the Americans lose. They still are in a position where they're eventually going to prevail, whether they win a particular battle or not.
And that was where, if I was going to make the case for American strength, I would say American strength over external factors, because the Americans would have won anyway. I don't think the British could have won by the nature of the conflict and what the objectives were, because the American objective is survive. I think unless you kill them all, the objective is not that difficult to achieve. You could argue in a way it was almost miraculous the British got so close to doing it. Like, if they'd have captured Washington at Long Island, or if Howe had been more ambitious and marched on Philadelphia in 1776, that they could have taken, if Washington was close to surrendering, that there was actually that possibility. But perhaps the Americans didn't realize their own strength, almost in a way as well. But I think the key thing, the American strength, is they just needed to survive and they could wait it out. I think that they just had so much territory they could retreat into. And I suppose money was a factor. But if you're really determined to fight for your independence, a lot of people were willing to sacrifice money. I mean, people did accept their monopoly money, although a lot of merchants preferred to trade with the British because they had money.
I
mean, if someone went to a shop and said, "Here, I've got £20 note or a 200 monopoly money," which would you like?
It's funny though, because that your argument,
crypto. This is like the original crypto. It's like, trust me, it will become a currency eventually.
But it's funny, your argument. I think the American strength argument is closest to the American myth, in that it's not it's really the morale of the Americans, their ability to hold on, and to believe that they're going to prevail in the long run.
And the fact they just had to outlast them, because they know that Britain runs out of money and can't afford to fight wars for a very long time. And I think that's why the French coming in just accept. Once the French came in, the Americans are like, we know they can't do this. We've seen this in the 7 Years' War. They can't sustain this long enough. So the external factors argument, you would argue, I guess, that it's really France, Spain. It's the globalization of the rebellion. It turns into a global war, where France is now threatening England directly. This was devastating. Like, it could have led to a rebellion in England, probably could have done, but the French Revolution, the propaganda against the French Revolution probably saved it. It could have ended up with a case of who was going to rebel first, the British or the French. It just so happened that the French fell first because their government's in a worse position. And at least taxation in England is raised by parliaments, theoretically through the people, whereas in French it was just imposed by an unelected monarch. And like, because there's that resistance, I think the British never taxed their population to the point of squeezing them into, whereas the French didn't care. They're just like, these poor people are there to serve us, and that's it. I don't care about that. You'd figure that, like, the French, I don't think, realized what they unleashed by allowing the Americans to win this. You know what I mean? They effectively unleashed the destruction of their own monarchy because they allowed those ideas to creep across.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think
the American Revolution had a direct influence on the French Revolution.
I think it had an influence. I'm just not sure whether it's a decisive one.
It certainly tipped it over. It gave a rallying point, and it gave, I suppose, it gave a sense of ideology and a sense of justification to what they already wanted to do, which in effect is what the ideology did in the American Revolution.
Maybe, but I mean, I think we're arguing now about the French Revolution, which is not.
Yeah.
Not our purpose.
We can make.
Wait.
I think you can make the case for all of these being the most important, depending on where you want to put the inflection points.
That's right.
But I just think, even though theoretically, if you looked at it in pure standard terms, it looks like the British should win this because they should. But it's not a standard war. And I think that's, again, it's maybe another misunderstanding. The British think they're going to win it because they look at it like a standard war, and the Americans think they're going to win it because it's an existential crisis for them. They have to win it. You can't say your liberty is at threat, tyranny is going to take you over, despotism is coming, your whole life is going to be destroyed. Oh yeah, we'll make peace with this. You can't make peace with despotism.
That's right. That's
as a British citizen.
That's a very early Whig thing to think, isn't it?
Yeah, but that's what they were doing. I mean, if they believe their own ideology, you can't make peace with despotism. And if
it's funny, it's funny when you think about that. Sorry.
No, go on. Say.
Well, it's funny when you think about that how the Second Amendment makes more sense in this context. The American anxiety that exists to this day, particularly among conservative Americans, of government expansion, government, despotism. It's actually a living political ideology to this day, isn't it?
I mean, look at the amendments. I'll just quickly run through them so we have much time. First Amendment prohibited Congress from establishing an official religion, problem with Catholicism from the Quebec Act, or interfering with freedom of speech, press, or peaceful assembly, because they were shut down, and they shut down the assembly in Boston and in New York and in other places, and they didn't allow them to have the press and freedom that they had to spread their ideology. Second Amendment, each state maintains a militia affirm the right to bear arms, because the British government tried to take their arms in Concord and Lexington, and they're aware that the government could steal it and they wouldn't be able to fight for their freedom. Third one, prohibited quartering of troops and civilians. That is a direct reference to the Quartering Act, which is what they'd been imposing all the way through. I mean, their fear was, when James Madison drafted this, the fear of the anti-federalists was that the president would become the king and that they would have the same elected dictatorship. Fourth, prohibited unreasonable searches and seizure of property. That's because they took all their ships in the harbor in Boston. They took other stuff. 5, no one bear witness against themselves. 6, tried by impartial jury. 7, right to jury in civil disputes. 8, no cruel and unusual punishments. Ironic that they were doing tar and feathering, but they were. That's all. The fact that 4 of them are directly for trial by jury shows that the Vice Admiralty Court moving up to Nova Scotia is vitally important. That the fact they were going to move murder trials to Britain is vitally important. The fact that they were reducing trial by jury, the fact that in the Quebec Act they wanted to remove trial by jury in Canada. All of these things are clearly on their minds. The 9th one made it clear that not all rights were necessarily defined in the Constitution, just in case they remember any other ones. And the 10th is like the rights not transferred to the federal government remain with the states, because they didn't want an open, mighty federal power. I think if you look at those first 10 amendments, you can see they are directly related to the Intolerable Acts, the Quebec Act, and the events of 1774, 75. They're so etched in their mind. And that, for me, is the biggest evidence for why the ideology matters and why they really believed it was despotic, is the Bill of Rights. I think the Bill of Rights is the best evidence to show that they genuinely believe this was a problem, and the Declaration of Independence is the best best piece of evidence to suggest that the ideology was real to them.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a convincing argument.
Yeah, that's when people say it was economic and not ideology. I'm looking at those 2 documents saying they enshrined that, and that was in the Constitution. You know what I mean? So that you wouldn't put it in there if there wasn't genuine fear of that.
Yeah.
You don't put fake bogeymen into your Constitution. It's like, oh, we're going to be in case there's.
Well, you can.
Well, that is true. Actually, I could imagine Trump doing that, to be fair. I could definitely see him doing that. But like when he creates his new constitution, when he overthrows the American government and destroys the entire founding principles of the republic, which he's going to do next year, Project 2025, apparently.
Right, that's for another episode, though.
Or the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, we got into modern ones. Yeah, so we agree. Then it can be any one of these. I think you can make a strong case for all, and it really depends where you put it.
Absolutely, yeah. As long as you consider the counter arguments.
Yeah,
I think you'd be very strong.
That's what they have to do. I like this course because I think apart from the 7 Years War essay, which we'll get onto when we get to Unit 1, I think you can argue who's to blame. You can argue anything, why they want it. I think you can argue anything. You just got to find your arguments. It just depends where you put the weight on your arguments, I think I would lean American strength because I just think it was inevitable. I don't think they could. I think it was inevitable they win this, except for very few small moments.
Okay.
And if you had to pick one, still leaning British weakness.
Yeah, I'm inclined to say British weakness may be combined with external factors, but from the perspective of British weakness, so having to fight the French, fight the Spanish.
I definitely think the external factors ended the war faster. I definitely think it was the driving force. It's just whether it changed the narrative, changed the direction, or whether it just accelerated it. And I'm inclined to believe it accelerated.
Yeah. Very good.
All right, cool. We finished that then. So then we can finish on that one. Good.